Wind howled through the canyon, rattling the thin glass of the cabin window. She crossed 4 states for a man who took one look at her dust-streaked face and shook his head. Standing in his kitchen, smelling of stale train smoke, she swallowed her humiliation like a jagged stone. The silence in the cabin was heavier than the snow clouds gathering over the ridge. Hollis Boone stood by the cast-iron stove, a massive silhouette blocking the meager light from the window. He smelled of split pine, tanned leather, and the sharp, coppery tang of animal blood. His hands, thick-knuckled and scarred, were shoved deep into the pockets of his canvas trousers. He wouldn't look at her. Not anymore. He had looked once, when he opened the door, and that single gutting glance had been enough to strip the last 6 months of hope straight from her bones. "I made a mistake," he said. His voice was a low rumble, rough as the bark on the timber walls. "You can't stay here." Cora Miller didn't flinch. She wanted to. Her knees, bruised and aching from 3 days on a rigid train bench and 2 more inside a springless stagecoach, threatened to buckle. The hem of her wool skirt was stiff with frozen mud. Her corseted ribs ached with every shallow breath, but she locked her jaw. She didn't cry. Tears were a luxury for women who had somewhere soft to fall. Cora had spent her last $14 on the stage ticket to this god-forsaken stretch of the Wyoming Territory. She had nothing left but the carpet bag currently cutting a deep red crease into her palm. "You wrote the letters," Cora said. Her voice sounded thin to her own ears, scraping against the dry, smoky air of the cabin. "Winter makes a man write things he don't mean," Hollis replied, his gaze fixed on the soot-stained belly of the stove. "It gets quiet up here. A man loses his sense. But I'm looking at you now, and I'm telling you the truth. You wouldn't last a month. The mountain would eat you alive, and I ain't digging a grave in frozen dirt." He thought he was being merciful. Cora could hear it in the tired, flat cadence of his voice. He looked at her pale skin, her delicate, soot-stained travel jacket, the frantic pulse beating at the base of her throat, and saw only a liability. He didn't see the years she had spent scrubbing boarding house floors in St. Louis until her knuckles bled. He didn't see the sheer, jagged stubbornness that had kept her alive when the cholera took her sister. He just saw a city girl who had no business breathing his thin, biting air. Cora set the carpetbag down. The dull times, thump times, seemed to echo in the small space. "The stage doesn't come back through the valley for 3 days, she said, stripping off her leather gloves. Her fingers were stark white, the joints swollen and stiff from the cold. Hollis shifted his weight. The floorboards groaned in protest. "There's a way station down the trail, about 5 miles. Old man named Gable runs it. He can put you up until the stage comes. I'll pay your fare back east." Back east. To what? To the sneers of the boarding house matron? To the relentless, grinding poverty that tasted like stale bread and smelled like lye soap? 5 miles, Cora repeated, her tone entirely devoid of inflection. She walked toward the center of the room. The cabin was Spartan. A heavy wooden table, 2 chairs, a bed in the corner built into the wall, and a hearth blackened by years of use. Everything felt coarse, heavy, and undeniably male. "I'll take you down there," Hollis offered, a flicker of guilt finally cracking his stoic facade. He reached for his heavy canvas coat, hanging on a peg. "No." The word hung in the air, sharp and unyielding. Hollis stopped, his hand hovering over the frayed collar of his coat. He finally turned his head to look at her. His eyes were a startling pale gray, the color of a frozen lake. They were weary, guarded eyes, heavily lined at the corners. "I am not walking 5 miles in the dark with a man who just told me I am entirely unwelcome," Cora said. She kept her chin level, though a violent shiver wrecked its way down her spine. The cabin was freezing, the draft seeping under the door bit at her ankles. "I'll leave at dawn, Miss Miller." "At dawn, Mr. Boone." She cut him off, her voice dropping into a register of pure, icy finality. "I am tired, I am cold, and I am entirely out of patience. I will sleep on your floor tonight. Tomorrow, when the sun is up, I will walk to this way station myself." She didn't wait for his permission. She walked to the hearth, dropping to her knees on the braided rag rug. The coarse wool scratched through her skirt. She pulled a tin matchbox from her coat pocket, her trembling fingers fumbling with the latch. Hollis watched her. For a moment, she thought he might physically pick her up and throw her out into the snow. He was large enough to do it without breaking a sweat. Instead, he let out a long, ragged exhale that sounded like a bellows deflating. He stepped forward, his heavy boots thudding against the pine planks. He didn't speak. He just knelt beside her. So close, she could feel the heat radiating off his body, smelling deeply of sweat and crushed sagebrush. He took the matchbox from her shaking hands. His calluses were rough as sandstone as his fingers brushed hers. He struck a match, the sulfur flaring bright and sharp, and touched it to the dry tinder he'd already laid in the grate. The fire caught, snapping hungrily at the birch bark. Hollis stood up, leaving the matches on the stone hearth. "Floor's going to be hard," he muttered, turning his back to her once more. "I've slept on worse," Cora lied. She pulled her knees to her chest, leaning as close to the growing fire as she dared, letting the heat slowly unthaw the edges of her bruised pride. Night swallowed the cabin whole, thick and suffocating. Outside, the wind had ceased being a mere sound. It was a physical entity, hurling itself against the log walls with violent, shuddering impacts. Cora lay on the rag rug, curled into a tight, miserable knot. She hadn't bothered to take off her boots or her coat. The floorboards were merciless, grinding against her hip and shoulder, telegraphing the deep subterranean freeze of the earth directly into her bones. She dozed in fitful, agonizing increments, waking every time the wind screamed down the chimney or a log popped in the grate. Across the room, in the heavy timber bed, Hollis was entirely still. But Cora knew he wasn't asleep. The rhythm of his breathing was too slow, too controlled. He was lying there in the dark, awake, acutely aware of the woman shivering on his floor. It was a maddening intimacy. Two strangers, bound by a handful of misguided letters, sharing a silence that felt thicker than the darkness. Cora's mind raced, chewing on the bitter cud of her reality. She was 26. In St. Louis, she was a spinster, a woman fading into the gray background of the industrial smog. Here, she was a mistake. A momentary lapse in judgment for a lonely mountain man who had sobered up to the harsh daylight of reality. A particularly violent gust of wind rattled the door on its iron hinges. A fine mist of snow blew through the cracks, settling like powdered sugar on the floorboards. Cora clamped her jaws together to keep her teeth from chattering. It was a losing battle. The cold was a living thing in the room, creeping away from the dying embers of the fire. She heard the creak of rope springs, the heavy thud of bare feet on wood. Cora squeezed her eyes shut, feigning sleep as the floorboards groaned under Hollis's weight. He moved with a surprising, quiet grace for a man of his size. She smelled him before she felt him, that grounding scent of wood smoke, old leather, and man. He knelt by the hearth. The iron poker scraped against the stone as he stirred the coals. He fed 2 thick logs into the belly of the stove. The heat bloomed almost instantly, pressing against Cora's frozen cheeks. She expected him to go back to bed. Instead, he stood over her. She could feel his shadow, a heavy density in the flickering orange light. A moment later, something massive and impossibly heavy settled over her. The scent was wild musk, dust, and thick, raw fur. It was a bearskin pelt. It pressed her into the floor, but the warmth was immediate, trapping her body heat, sinking into her shivering limbs like a physical embrace. Hollis lingered for a second. Cora opened her eyes, just a fraction, peering through her lashes. He was looking down at her, his brow furrowed, his mouth pulled into a tight, conflicted line. He looked exhausted. He ran a hand through his dark, unkempt hair, then turned and walked back to the shadows of his bed. Cora didn't move. She lay under the crushing weight of the pelt, her heart hammering a frantic, uneven rhythm against her ribs, and finally, mercifully, fell asleep. When she woke, the fire was nothing but a bed of gray ash. Her mouth tasted like copper and old dust. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest as she pushed the heavy bearskin off and sat up. She looked toward the window. It wasn't dawn. Or rather, it was, but the light was a sick, bruised gray. The glass was entirely plated in white. The wind wasn't howling anymore. It was a sustained, deafening roar. A locomotive tearing through the canyon without end. Hollis was already up. He stood by the kitchen table, fully dressed in his canvas coat and heavy leather gloves, sharpening a hunting knife on a whetstone. Shh, 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 shh. The sound was rhythmic, grating. "What time is it?" Cora asked, her voice cracking. "Past 7, Hollis said, not looking up from the blade. Cora touched her hair, feeling the messy, tangled rat's nest of pins. She stood up, her joints popping in the frigid air. She walked to the window and scraped a fingernail against the frost. She couldn't see the pines outside. She couldn't see the shed. There was only a violent, swirling wall of white. "Blizzard," Hollis said, reading her mind. "Rolled in around 3 in the morning. Dropped 2 feet already. It'll drop 3 more before nightfall." Cora stared at the whiteout. The cynical, hardened core of her chest tightened. Of course she would be trapped here. She turned away from the window and walked straight to her carpet bag. She knelt, checking the brass clasps, ensuring they were locked. She stood, grabbing the leather handles, and hoisted the heavy bag against her leg. Hollis finally stopped sharpening the knife. He looked at her, his pale eyes narrowing. "What do you think you're doing?" "I said I would leave at dawn," Cora said, walking toward the heavy oak door. "It's past dawn. Are you out of your mind?" Hollis dropped the knife on the table. It landed with a heavy, dangerous clatter. "You can't see 10 feet out there. The temperature is 0 and dropping. You'll freeze to death before you make it past the tree line." "Then I'll freeze," Cora snapped, her composure finally fracturing. The raw, jagged emotion she'd been holding back since yesterday bled into her voice. "I'm not staying in a place where I'm not wanted, Mr. Boone. I have pride, even if I have nothing else. You made it perfectly clear last night that my presence is a burden. I am relieving you of it." She reached for the iron latch. The metal was so cold it burned her bare skin. Before she could lift it, a hand clamped over hers. He was incredibly fast. Hollis was suddenly towering over her, his chest brushing her shoulder. His hand covered hers entirely, his grip firm but careful not to crush her fragile fingers against the iron latch. The heat of his skin seared through the chill in her bones. Cora froze, her breath catching in her throat. She looked up. Hollis was staring down at her, his jaw locked, a muscle ticking violently in his cheek. The sheer physical presence of him was overwhelming. He smelled of the cold, of the fire, of quiet desperation. "Move," she whispered, though her voice betrayed her, trembling slightly. "No. You told me to leave. I told you you couldn't survive here." Hollis's voice was a low, ragged scrape. He didn't let go of her hand. His thumb brushed against the angry red blister on her knuckle, a startlingly gentle motion that sent a shockwave up her arm. "There's a difference." "Not to me," Cora shot back, her eyes burning with unshed, furious tears. She tried to yank her hand away, but he held fast. "Let me go. I'm not letting you walk out into a whiteout just because I was a fool yesterday," Hollis said. He stepped closer, crowding her against the thick wood of the door. The internal contradiction in his eyes was naked, now the intense desire to push her away, warring violently with the instinct to pull her in. He released her hand, but only to reach up. His thick fingers grasped the heavy, squared beam of oak, resting in the iron brackets beside the frame. With a grunt of effort, he hoisted the timber and dropped it directly across the door. The heavy thwack times of the wood, locking into place, echoed in her chest. He lowered his arms, boxing her in, his hands resting on the door on either side of her head. He leaned down, his face inches from hers, his pale eyes burning with a sudden dark intensity. "You want to leave? You leave when the sky clears," Hollis murmured, his breath ghosting over her frozen cheek. "But you don't cross that threshold today. Not alone." The heavy oak timber rested in its iron brackets, a thick, insurmountable line drawn between the harshness of the Wyoming territory and the sudden, suffocating intimacy of the cabin. Hollis stepped back. The sudden absence of his body heat left Cora shivering, though whether from the draft or the violent adrenaline spike in her blood, she couldn't tell. She stared at the barred door, her chest heaving against the rigid boning of her corset. "You don't get to decide when I leave," Cora said. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the room like a straight razor. I just did, Hollis replied. He didn't sound triumphant. He sounded resigned, heavy with a burden he hadn't wanted to carry, but couldn't bring himself to set down. He walked away from her, his boots dragging slightly on the floorboards. He went straight to the cast-iron pump at the iron sink, priming the handle until water gushed out in a freezing, erratic stream. He filled an enameled percolator, his movements mechanical. He wasn't looking at her. He was giving her space to collect the shattered pieces of her dignity. Cora remained by the door for a long time. Her hands still hovered near the freezing iron latch. She wanted to scream. She wanted to hurl her heavy carpetbag at his broad back and demand he unbar the door. But outside, the wind let out a deafening, localized shriek, shaking the very foundation of the cabin. A sharp crack echoed from the tree line, a pine limb snapping under the immense weight of the snow. If she walked out there, she would die. It wasn't a metaphor. It was a cold, brutal fact. With a tight, jerky motion, Cora grabbed the handles of her bag. She didn't drag it. She lifted it, her bicep burning, and carried it back to the hearth. She set it down with deliberate care, refusing to let him hear even a fraction of her exhaustion. Hollis moved around the small kitchen area. He sliced thick, uneven slabs of salt pork with the hunting knife he'd been sharpening. The meat hit the cast-iron skillet with a sharp, violent hiss, immediately filling the room with the heavy, greasy scent of rendered fat and salt. He threw a handful of coarse coffee grounds into the percolator and shoved it onto the hottest part of the stove. He worked in absolute silence. It wasn't the comfortable quiet of old companions. It was the tense, vibrating silence of two feral animals trapped in a canyon. Cora unbuttoned her travel jacket. Her fingers were thawing, the blood returning in painful, stinging prickles. She hung the damp wool on the back of a chair, pulling it close to the hearth. She sat down, keeping her spine ruthlessly straight, and stared into the fire. Coffee's ready, Hollis said roughly, 20 minutes later. Cora didn't turn around. I don't want any. A heavy pause. Then the scrape of a chair. Hollis walked over and placed a chipped tin cup on the hearthstone, inches from her boot. The coffee was black, thick as mud, and smelled intensely bitter. Drink it, he ordered softly, or you'll start shaking again. Cora glared at the cup. She hated that he was right. Her core was locked in a deep, subterranean freeze that the fire couldn't entirely touch. She picked up the tin. It scalded her palms, but she welcomed the pain. It grounded her. She took a sip. It tasted like scorched earth and copper, but it traced a line of intense, necessary heat straight down into her stomach. Hollis went back to the table and sat. He ate his salt pork directly from the pan, using a piece of hardtack to wipe the grease. He chewed slowly, his pale eyes tracking her every movement. I expected someone different, he said abruptly. The words seemed to tear their way out of his throat, rough and unpolished. Cora gripped the tin cup with both hands, refusing to look at him. You expected someone prettier, someone younger, a farm girl who knew how to skin a buck and smile while she did it. No, Hollis said. The flat denial made her turn her head. He was leaning forward, his elbows resting on his knees. I expected a fragile thing. A parlor girl who read my letters and thought she was coming to a dime novel romance. I saw your hands when you took your gloves off yesterday. Cora instinctively curled her fingers inward, hiding the swollen knuckles and the pale, thick scars from years of lye, soap, and scrub brushes. You've worked, he said, stating a fact, not a question. I've survived, Mr. Boone. There is a distinction, Cora said sharply. I spent 10 years cleaning up after men who wore finer suits than you, but possessed half the manners. I did not come here expecting a romance. I came here expecting a roof that didn't leak and a man who kept his word. Hollis flinched. It was a minuscule movement, a slight tightening of his jaw, a rapid blink, but Cora saw it. I wrote those letters in February, Hollis said, his voice dropping an octave, blending with the low roar of the stove. I had a fever for 2 weeks, thought I was going to die in this bed, staring at the ceiling, and nobody would find me until the spring thaw. I wrote them because I was terrified of dying alone. He stood up, carrying the heavy skillet back to the stove. The clatter of iron on iron was loud in the small room. "When you stepped off that stage yesterday," Hollis continued, his back to her, his shoulders rigid, "you were pale as a sheet. You looked like a strong wind would snap you in half. I looked at you, and I saw a woman I was going to bury before Christmas. I sent you away, because I couldn't bear the thought of killing you with this mountain." Cora stared at his broad back. The anger that had been keeping her upright slowly began to calcify into something else, something complicated. "I decide what kills me," Cora said, her voice dropping the icy formality. "Not you. You don't get to absolve yourself of your cowardice by pretending it was for my protection." Hollis turned around. He stared at her, the muscle in his jaw working frantically. He didn't argue. He just nodded, once, a slow, agonizing admission of defeat. By nightfall, the cabin was a pressurized capsule of heat and tension. Outside, the blizzard continued its relentless assault, a white wall pressing against the frosted glass. They hadn't spoken since the afternoon. Cora had taken over the kitchen space, needing to move, needing to prove her utility. She found a sack of flour, dried apples, and a tin of lard. She didn't ask permission. She rolled up her sleeves, exposing pale forearms bruised from her journey, and began to work the dough. Hollis sat at the table, repairing a broken leather harness with an awl and thick waxed thread. But he wasn't working. He was watching her. He watched the capable, rhythmic motion of her hands. He watched the way she tested the heat of the stove with a quick, fearless flick of water from her fingertips. He watched the stubborn set of her jaw. The smell of baking apples and browning crust began to push back against the stale scent of smoke and isolation. It was the first time in 4 years the cabin had smelled like anything other than survival. Cora pulled the heavy iron Dutch oven from the coals, her face flushed with the intense heat. She set it on the trivet and sliced a thick, steaming piece of the rustic pie onto a tin plate. She walked over to the table and set it down in front of Hollis, right over his tangled leather harness. He stopped moving. He looked at the pie, then slowly looked up at her. His gray eyes were entirely stripped of their earlier coldness. They were raw, exhausted, and desperately hungry, and not just for the food. "I am not fragile, Hollis," Cora said softly. It was the first time she had used his given name. It tasted strange on her tongue, heavy and intimate. "I am angry. I am tired, but I do not break." Hollis stared at her. Slowly, he reached out. He didn't touch the plate. He touched her hand. His fingers wrapped around her wrist. His calluses were rough, scraping against her skin, but his touch was excruciatingly gentle. He pulled her hand toward him, turning it palm up. He traced the deep, red crease where her carpetbag had dug into her skin. He traced the pale, faded burn scars on her knuckles. Cora's breath hitched. A violent tremor ran through her body, entirely unrelated to the cold. She didn't pull away. "I was a fool," Hollis murmured. He didn't look up from her hand. His thumb stroked her palm, a slow, mesmerizing friction. "I saw the soot on your face and thought you belonged in the city. I didn't see the iron." He finally looked up. The distance between them had vanished. The air in the cabin felt thick, heavy with the scent of baked sugar and raw, unfiltered want. "The storm will break by morning," Cora whispered, her voice unsteady. "The sky will clear. You said I could leave when it clears." Hollis stood up. He was so large he seemed to eclipse the lantern light. He didn't let go of her hand. He took a step closer, his chest brushing against the rough wool of her bodice. The heat radiating from him was intoxicating. "I said you couldn't cross that threshold alone," Hollis corrected, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated against her collarbone. "I didn't say I'd ever take the bar off the door." Cora looked up into his face. The deep lines around his eyes weren't just from the sun and the wind. They were carved by years of brutal, gnawing loneliness. She saw the fear he had admitted to earlier, the terror of failing her, warring with a sudden, fierce possessiveness. "You told me I wouldn't last a month," Cora challenged, though the fight had bled entirely out of her tone. "I've been wrong before," Hollis said. He raised his free hand, his thick fingers hesitating for a fraction of a second before they touched her face. He brushed a stray, flour-dusted curl away from her cheek. His touch was reverent, almost terrified. "Prove me wrong, Cora. Stay and prove me wrong." Cora closed her eyes, leaning an imperceptible fraction of an inch into his rough palm. The exhaustion of her journey, the biting humiliation of the day before, the years of grinding poverty, it all seemed to hit her at once, not as a crushing weight, but as a long, exhaled breath. She opened her eyes and met his gaze. The cynicism in her chest fractured, making room for something terrifying and entirely new. "If I stay," Cora said, her voice steadying, "you don't ever tell me what I can or cannot survive again." Hollis's mouth twitched, the ghost of a smile finally cracking the hardened mask of his face. He released her wrist, moving his hands to cup her face entirely, his thumbs tracing her cheekbones. "Deal," he whispered. Outside, the wind screamed against the timber walls, rattling the frosted glass in a furious, futile attempt to break in. But inside the cabin, standing in the golden, flickering light of the hearth, the cold had finally lost its grip. Hollis leaned down, his mouth brushing hers in a tentative, rough, and deeply desperate kiss. Cora kissed him back, tasting coffee, wood smoke, and the absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The door remained barred. Neither of them looked at it again. If you felt the chill of the Wyoming wind and the heat of this slow-burn romance, don't let the story end here. Hit that like button if you want more gritty, untamed Wild West dramas. Subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss a tale of survival, heartbreak, and fierce love. Leave a comment below. Would you have braved the blizzard or stayed in the cabin? Share with your fellow romance lovers.